They say only 8 people died that night, but the train that left Cienaga tells a different story. So, what really happened when Colombia's army turned its guns on banana workers? I'm Arturo, and this is Latin Lore, from Latin America's history to mysteries and true crime to local legends whispering Latin intrigue. Every tale is verified in archives before it reaches your headphones. Hit subscribe, fresh revelations drop every week, ready for your next campfire debate. At dawn, a train stood near the station in Cienaga, and the town already knew the night had split history in two. One side would call it order, the other would call it slaughter. The rails did not argue. They only carried what men wanted to move before daylight could ask questions. And that is where our story begins, with iron, blood, and a number that refuses to stay still. How many died in the banana country of Magdalena, and why has Colombia spent generations fighting over the answer? Because this is not only a story about the dead, it is a story about who gets counted, who gets erased, and who writes the official version while the square is still wet. December 6th, 1928, did not arrive like thunder from a clear sky. It came after weeks of strike, after years of abuse, after a company built a kingdom in the tropics, and a government decided that workers asking for dignity sounded too much like rebellion. The land had been warning everyone. The powerful preferred not to hear it. To understand that night, we have to walk the zone slowly. We are on Colombia's Caribbean coast, in the department of Magdalena, around Cienaga and the great banana plain that stretches between the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta and the marshes near Ciénaga Grande. It was hot, flat, fertile country, a place where the air could feel heavy enough to wear, and the soil could make fortunes for men who did not always touch it with their own hands. From far away, it looked generous. Up close, it looked owned. The landscape itself carried the contradiction. To one side rose the Sierra, ancient, green, and watchful, older than republics, older than company seals, older than every speech later made to justify bloodshed. To the other side lay the waters and lowlands, shimmering under the sun, a geography of humidity, insects, transport, and labor. Between mountain and marsh, bananas spread across the plain in disciplined rows, as if nature itself had been taught to salute commerce. But beauty in our America has often been asked to serve someone else's ledger. By the first decades of the 20th century, this zone had become one of the great engines of Colombia's export economy. Bananas moved from field to rail, from rail to port, from port to steamship, and from steamship to tables far away. Towns rose around that rhythm. Shops, docks, workshops, offices, and family life all learned to breathe by the plantation clock. If the harvest moved, the region ate. If the harvest stopped, everyone felt the hand tighten. This was not just agriculture, it was an enclave, a whole little world arranged around one fruit and the power behind it. And the name behind that power was the United Fruit Company. Across the Caribbean basin, it spread from country to country, tying land, transport, exports, and politics into a long chain of dependence. In Colombia, as elsewhere, the company did not need to rule like a king in a crown. It ruled the modern way through contracts, ships, railways, storage houses, influence, credit, and the confidence that officials would confuse its interests with the nation's. Its white steamships could carry bananas north, and with them the illusion that tropical wealth had no human price. Now come closer, step off the postcard, forget the green abundance for a moment, and look at the human arrangement underneath. The company had administrative buildings, orderly compounds, and houses for hire staff that looked like another climate altogether. Many workers had something else: overcrowded camps, rough huts, poor sanitation, little water, little privacy, and the daily knowledge that their bodies were easier to replace than to protect. Tropical mud below, tropical heat above, and in the middle, a laborer trying to survive another shift without injury, fever, or debt swallowing the week's pay. One of the dirtiest tricks in that system wore the clean face of paperwork. Many laborers were hired through contractors. So when workers complained, the company could say, with a straight face polished by profit, that the men cutting bananas, clearing drains, loading wagons, and sustaining the whole machine were not really its employees. The workers knew how absurd that was. If your sweat feeds the company's trains, the company's ships, and the company's books, then the relationship is real no matter how cleverly a contract tries to hide it. Legal smoke can still smell like exploitation. That contractor system mattered because it helped the company dodge obligations. A worker injured on the job could be pushed aside, benefits could vanish into technicalities, compensation could be delayed, denied, or handed over to someone else's responsibility. The company enjoyed the labor directly and evaded the duties indirectly. The law existed, but for many workers it existed like a church bell heard from far away, real enough to recognize, too distant to protect. What the Banana Zone revealed, brutally, was the gap between a republic's promises and a laborer's lived reality. And the workers were not asking for the moon. They were asking for what should never have required a strike in the first place. They wanted collective insurance when death hovered so close to the fields. They wanted compensation for accidents because machetes, machines, heavy loads, and exhaustion do not forgive carelessness. They wanted hygienic dormitories, Sunday rest, better wages for the poorest, proper hospitals, and weekly cash pay, rather than systems that kept money circulating back into the company's own hands. Most of all, they wanted the contractor trick to end and their labor to be recognized honestly. That list mattered because it destroyed one of the oldest lies about the massacre. The workers were not gathering around some abstract fantasy. They were fighting for tangible things: rest, sanitation, money, medical care, protection, recognition. In other words, they were fighting to be treated like human beings inside a modern economy. That is what makes the latter talk of subversion so revealing. When elites call basic dignity dangerous, they are already confessing how much their order depends on somebody else's humiliation. The strike would expose that dependence like a nerve laid bare. The strike formally began on November 12th, 1928, and it did not stay small. More than 25,000 workers were drawn into it across the Banana Zone. That number alone tells you how deep the grievance ran. This was not a passing tantrum or a handful of agitators with loud voices. It was a collective decision by men who knew the machinery from the inside and understood that if the fruit stopped moving, the whole region would feel it. The strike was not random anger. It was organized clarity, and power is often most afraid of that. But the story was never only about payroll workers. The banana economy had wrapped itself around almost every part of local life. Once the strike tightened, other sectors felt the pressure too. Small growers resented the company's control over commercialization and credit. Merchants resented company stores that undercut local trade and ships that brought in competing goods. Towns that depended on consumption saw sales collapse when wages froze. So even though the workers stood at the center, the whole region trembled with them. In an enclave economy, one stoppage can reveal every hidden dependency at once. For a moment, the newspapers still sounded hopeful. Reports suggested that government mediators had arrived from Bogota, that ministers and labor officials were trying to prevent disaster, that moderation and legality might still prevail. The language was familiar, full of official calm, the kind printed when institutions want to be seen as reasonable before history asks what they actually did. You could almost believe a settlement was near. But power often speaks most politely right before it loses patience. In the Banana Zone, dialogue was already being slowly replaced by the colder grammar of force. The company tried the old tactic of buying time. It paid overdue wages to ease pressure, a move that looked conciliatory only if you ignored the strategy underneath. Pay a little, stall a little, divide a little, and hope hunger breaks the strike before justice ever has to be discussed seriously. But the workers did not fold. The movement kept holding, and with every extra day the fruit left uncut, the money left unmoved, and the nerves of the powerful grew more exposed. Rotten bananas in the fields can be more frightening to an enclave than speeches in a square. As the strike dragged on, economic losses mounted. Commerce suffered. Debt collection became harder. The fruit spoiled. Families worried. Towns that had grown around the banana rhythm began to feel how fragile that prosperity really was. This is another part of the truth often forgotten. The company had indeed brought growth, but it was a growth so concentrated that the whole region had learned to depend on a single economic pulse. That made the strike powerful, yes, but it also made the coming repression easier to sell. Elites could present the workers as enemies of the public good, and Colombia was already governed by an old conservative order deeply suspicious of mass labor. The country had seen workers shot before, and the ruling classes had long practiced in confusing social demands with threats to civilization. In that political climate, a large strike in a strategic export zone did not appear to officials as a question of labor rights. It began to appear as disorder, contagion, embarrassment, and danger. Once a government starts describing a social wound as a security problem, the room for compromise shrinks. After that, the rifles are never far away. By late November and early December, the Banana Zone was being militarized in earnest. More troops were sent to Cienaga, searches increased, roads and rail lines were watched. Local authorities were increasingly overshadowed by military presence. The message was clear even before the first shot. The state was preparing to answer organized labor not with reform, but with discipline. Emergency has a smell, and the towns could already feel it in the air. The kind of men arriving now were not there to inspect dormitories, calculate wages, or improve hospitals. They were there to make obedience visible. One revealing detail cuts straight through all later excuses. Troops from outside the region were brought in because authorities worried local soldiers might hesitate. Why would they hesitate? Because local men had brothers, cousins, neighbors, and friends among the strikers. Some had worked in the banana world themselves. The state knew exactly what it might soon be asking of its armed force, and it preferred hands less tied by memory. That single choice tells you almost everything. When a government imports emotional distance, it is already imagining violence. It wants trigger fingers with no family standing in the crowd. Meanwhile, the means of communication tightened like a fist. Trains were searched or seized for troop movement. Telephones, telegraph lines, mail, and press circulation all operated under growing pressure. The railway, usually the proud steel vein of the banana economy, began changing character before people's eyes. It was no longer only carrying fruit and passengers. It carried surveillance, soldiers, and warnings. Watch the train closely in this story because it keeps returning. First, it serves commerce. Then it serves control. Later, in memory, it will become something even darker, the metal ghost of what authorities tried to remove. And there was another shadow hanging over the coast. United States diplomats were concerned for the safety of company personnel and property. A vessel moved toward the Caribbean shore under the guise of protection, not war. Whether direct intervention was imminent is still argued over, but the important thing is that the possibility mattered. Colombian authorities knew foreign eyes were on the banana zone. In our history, local elites have often become more ruthless under that kind of gaze, eager to prove they can preserve order, eager to show that capital has nothing to fear from the people who generate it. At the same time, the official story was already being rewritten while the strike was still alive. Authorities and friendly voices increasingly described the movement not as a labor struggle, but as a revolutionary disturbance. The word strike began to lose ground to words like subversion, agitation, radicalism, and even communism. This is one of the oldest political spells in the book. First, workers ask for wages in hospitals. Then, the power renames them as a threat to the republic. Once that renaming takes hold, bullets can pretend to be patriotism, and a massacre can be marketed as public health for the nation. On December 5th, the government declared a state of siege in the region. Special powers were granted. The banana zone entered the dark chamber, where normal guarantees go to die, and every abuse claims legal parentage. Movement would soon require papers. Travel would need authorization. The civilian world shrank while the military one expanded. But what mattered most that night was that the workers and their supporters were concentrated in Cienaga, near the station and public square, still visible, still gathered, still believing that if the country could see them clearly enough, perhaps the country would not let them be crushed. Picture the scene. Evening settles over Cienaga. The station area is alive with strikers, sympathizers, relatives, and townspeople. Flags are raised. One is the national flag, because the workers are insisting they belong to the country whose laws they are invoking. Another is red, because labor also speaks in the colors of struggle. Testimonies remember the image of Simon Bolivar there as well, the old liberator hanging over a conflict that exposed how unfinished liberation still was. The crowd carried not only anger but symbolism. They were staging a moral argument in public. There was music, too, a detail that makes the whole scene more human and more unbearable. Some witnesses described a band playing as the crowd held its ground. Think about that for a second. Not because this was a festival, because people under pressure often reach for music, flags, and ceremony to steady themselves against fear. There was even a remembered slogan, sharp as a blade, declaring that soldiers were for foreign oil pirates, not for Colombian workers. In one line, the crowd named the betrayal. They could already feel where the rifles were pointing. Then the authorities moved to disperse the gathering. A decree was read. Troops took positions. The square became a theater where the state meant to prove something. Accounts differ on the exact length of the final warning. Some later versions make it sound longer, others shorter. Still, everyone agrees on its essential shape. There was a brief ultimatum, bugles sounded, and the crowd did not fully disperse. Some stayed out of conviction, some stayed because packed crowds do not vanish on command. Some stayed because they still believed the state was performing intimidation, not preparing for execution. And then came that terrible silence that arrives before irreversible decisions. The bugles had spoken. The flags were still there. The crowd remained in place. The soldiers had their positions. And across that square passed one of the coldest ideas in political history, the idea that a social conflict can be solved by making an example of human bodies. Orders were given. The troops were ready. The nation, though it did not yet know it, was only seconds away from receiving one of its deepest scars. There are nights when history stops breathing right before it screams. The command came to fire, not to isolate supposed ringleaders, not to make arrests, not to reopen the negotiation, to fire. Rifles cracked, machine guns spoke, and whatever official language came afterward, whatever decree, cable, editorial, or corporate statement, this remains the central fact that no serious history can dodge. In Cienaga, on the night of December 5th, into the early hours of December 6th, 1928, the Colombian army opened fire on a crowd gathered during the banana strike. Everything else may blur around it. That fact does not. That is the stone at the center of the fog. Once the shooting began, the crowd broke into terror. Bodies fell. Others stumbled over those bodies. People tried to run, crawl, drag the wounded, or simply make themselves smaller than bullets. The square, which minutes earlier had held flags, music, and public defiance, turned into a trap. Relatives searched through confusion. Men shouted names that were swallowed by gunfire. The state had converted a civic space into a killing ground. This is why the event never fit comfortably inside official language. Words like order and restoration cannot wash away the image of workers and civilians cut down in a town square. What happened in the minutes after the firing is part of why the death count remains such a wound. The first official versions were suspiciously tidy, low enough to defend, clean enough to print, and convenient enough to protect those who gave the orders. But the ground itself seemed to reject those neat figures. Witnesses, later reporting, and political opponents all pushed the number upward. Some spoke of dozens. There are many more. A famous diplomatic communication repeated the claim that the dead may have exceeded 1,000, and over time, literary memory would make the scale even more haunting and unforgettable. Here, honesty matters more than drama. There is no secure final ledger. The exact number of dead cannot be established with confidence from surviving evidence. The smallest official counts are widely seen as unreliable. The largest numbers cannot be confirmed cleanly enough to pretend the archive has settled them forever. What can be said with confidence is harder and, in some ways, more disturbing. Many more people died than the first careful official statements admitted, and the confusion around the number is itself part of the history. Concealment entered the story almost as quickly as blood. This is why the train keeps returning to memory. Many testimonies insisted that bodies were removed rapidly, loaded onto rail cars, and taken away before families could count them properly. Some versions speak of mass graves in inaccessible places. Not every detail can be proved with the precision a court clerk would love, and we should not pretend otherwise. But those testimonies did not survive for almost a century by accident. They survived because people felt that the dead had been handled not only with violence, but with administrative disappearance. The rails became part of the wound. The propaganda machine moved fast. The Ministry of War insisted there was no strike in Magdalena, only revolution. Newspapers friendly to order echoed talk of bandits, insurgents, and dangerous radicals. The company, for its part, described the conflict abroad as of a revolutionary character, now moving toward resolution. Listen to the insult hidden in that word, resolution. As if bullets had merely clarified a misunderstanding, power often tries to perfume its crimes with administrative language. It wants freight moving, papers stamped, and memory disciplined before the families have even finished looking for the missing. Some foreign coverage made the story even dirtier by blaming outside incendiaries, as if the workers of Colombia could not possibly understand their own exploitation without being coached by strangers. That trick appears whenever poor people organize too coherently for elite comfort, but the evidence left behind shows something far more grounded. The strike grew out of real labor grievances: contractor abuse, unsafe conditions, low pay, poor housing, weak hospital services, company store dependence, and the refusal to recognize workers directly. The banana workers did not need foreign scripts to know when they were being used and discarded. Not every national voice accepted the official framing so easily. Some newspapers outside the region, even when cautious or conservative in tone, acknowledged that many of the workers' demands were just. Some criticized the use of force and warned that violence was no legitimate answer to labor claims. Others still blamed leaders for letting the conflict harden. That complexity matters. Public opinion did not speak with one voice. But even where opinions differed on tactics and leadership, the massacre forced a larger truth into view. Colombia's institutions had answered a social question with military logic, and the country could not entirely unsee it. After the shooting, the repression did not politely stop at the edge of the square. It spread across the zone through passes, checkpoints, arrests, and surveillance. With the state of siege in force, movement became controlled. To travel, people needed authorization. To leave the region, many had to secure papers from the same apparatus that had just terrorized them. Imagine the humiliation of that. Imagine looking for a missing brother at dawn and then having to ask an officer for permission to flee the town by afternoon. That is how violence lengthens its shadow after the gunfire ends. Witnesses who escaped described a Cienaga transformed into a town of shut doors and held breath. Streets are nearly empty. Shops closed. Families are silent inside their houses. Boats are inspected before departure. Passengers counted, questioned, and checked. The contrast was brutal. Hours earlier, the station area had been full of bodies, slogans, music, and visible defiance. Now the town felt hollowed out, like fear itself had taken up residence in every doorway. When a massacre succeeds, it not only kills, but also it empties the streets. It teaches survivors to measure every sound. It turns ordinary movement into something that feels illegal. The military also pressed into the wider Banana Zone, trying to break the strike completely and hunt down those who remained organized. Troops moved along the railway and through surrounding localities. Arrests multiplied. Surviving leaders and suspected supporters were treated as outlaws. Decrees painted the strikers as enemies of public order, as if the dead and the frightened had somehow been the true source of danger. This is another familiar ritual in our history. First, the state fires, then it writes decrees explaining that the people who were shot had forced its hand. Paper comes in afterward to help the bullets sound reasonable. In the aftermath, rage and hunger also burst loose. Offices linked to the company and the railway were attacked in some places. Stores were looted for food. This matters because power loves to point at later disorder and use it as a retroactive excuse, as if desperation after a massacre can justify the massacre itself. It cannot. What those scenes reveal is not the righteousness of repression, but the wreckage it leaves behind. A region already strained by weeks of stoppage had now been broken open by terror. People were grieving, fleeing, starving, and searching. Order had been restored only for those who counted exports, and that is why it is too small to say this was only a dispute between one company and one group of workers. The strike and the massacre exposed the entire anatomy of the enclave. Growers, merchants, officials, transport workers, families, local politicians, and national authorities were all entangled in the banana machine. The company's power touched credit, transport, commerce, and municipal life. The government's decisions protected more than property. They protected a model of society in which prosperity could be publicly praised. At the same time, misery was hidden just behind the packing houses. The workers had forced that contradiction into daylight. Local elite families had long learned how to live profitably beside the company's shadow. Political offices, commercial influence, and plantation wealth often stood close enough to share air. That does not mean every notable in Magdalena met secretly to choreograph every move. History is usually messier than conspiracy theory. But it does mean that when the crisis deepened, institutions were already leaning toward one side. The company did not need to issue magical commands to control the state. It was enough that officials, growers, merchants, and administrators understood where power rested and whom the existing order was designed to protect. What followed in national politics proved that the massacre could not be sealed inside regional silence. Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, then a rising liberal voice, seized on the killings and carried them into the broader Colombian conscience. In speeches and debates, he denounced the alliance of oligarchic power, foreign capital, and state violence. He understood something crucial. What happened in Cienaga was not a provincial accident. It was a moral revelation. If workers asking for legal recognition, safer conditions, and decent treatment could be answered with machine guns, then the Republic itself stood accused before its own people. The massacre did not topple the conservative order overnight. History rarely grants justice that quickly, but the event deepened a crack already running through that long regime. When the Liberals won the presidency in 1930, ending decades of conservative hegemony, the Banana Massacre remained part of the dark record people remembered. Not the only reason for political change, no, but one of the bloodstains could not be scrubbed from the public floor. Cienaga became one of those names that travel beyond geography. It became an argument against the old order whenever the country spoke about power. For Colombian labor history, the event matters for another reason too. It revealed how modern capitalism in the tropics often worked through a strange double gesture. On the one hand, it brought rail lines, export growth, urban services, and commercial energy. On the other hand, it rested on legal ambiguity, precarious labor, poor housing, weak protections, and the state's willingness to use force when workers pushed too hard. That contradiction is the true machinery beneath the banana. The fruit looked clean in foreign markets because somebody else had already been made dirty, sick, indebted, or disposable along the way. And the workers themselves must not be reduced to victims alone. Before they were shot, they organized, they named abuses clearly, they understood the importance of stopping production. They built committees, coordinated pressure, and transformed private suffering into public demands. That matters deeply. Power prefers the poor to be either silent or chaotic. What frightened the banana order was not only anger, it was lucidity. The workers had reviewed the system and identified its weaknesses. They knew that if the train stalled and the fruit rotted, the company's language of inevitability would suddenly sound much less sacred. That clarity made them dangerous. There is bitter irony in the infrastructure, too. The railway was sold as progress, and in one sense it was. It connected places, accelerated transport, and reorganized regional life. But infrastructure is never innocent. The same rail that carried bananas to the port could carry troops into town. The same network that made export efficient could make repression efficient. In the memory of the massacre, the train becomes the perfect symbol of enclave modernity. First, it promises prosperity, then it delivers soldiers. Later, according to many testimonies and the force of collective memory, it helps remove the dead from counting. And then literature entered the wound. On March 6th, 1927, in nearby Aracataca, Gabriel Garcia Marquez had been born into that same banana world, into the atmosphere that would later feed his imagination. Decades afterward, in 100 Years of Solitude, he transformed the massacre into one of the most unforgettable scenes in modern fiction. That matters immensely, but it has to be handled with respect. Literature did not create the massacre. It gave the massacre an immortal echo. It expressed the truth of denial, disappearance, and official forgetting in a form that no decree could fully contain. The famous image of the train of the dead and the vast number attached to it lives partly in that literary afterlife. And here we have to walk carefully. Fiction is not an archive, and we do history no favors by pretending it is. But neither is fiction irrelevant. Sometimes literature preserves a social truth that official documents are built to suffocate. The power of Garcia Marquez's version is not that it settles the body count like a court registry. Its power is that it captures what it feels like when a massacre is followed by denial, so shameless that reality itself starts sounding unbelievable. That is why the death toll remains such a haunting problem. The archive does not hand us a final honest number and then rest. Instead, it gives us contradiction, self-protection, rumor, testimony, politics, grief, and silence. Some commentators have wanted that uncertainty to weaken the event, as if the inability to count everybody perfectly makes the massacre less central. It does the opposite. When states repress labor and then muddy the record, uncertainty becomes part of the evidence. The missing arithmetic is not a footnote. It is one more sign of how thoroughly the dead were denied a dignified reckoning. So what is the strongest, most grounded explanation of what happened? It is this. In the banana zone of Magdalena, a major strike grew out of real labor grievances: direct recognition, fairer wages, accident compensation, rest, sanitation, hospital care, and freedom from the contractor system and company store dependence. The United Fruit Company's enormous regional power shaped the whole setting. The Colombian government, fearing disorder, economic damage, and political embarrassment, militarized the conflict. In Cienaga, troops opened fire on a crowd of strikers and supporters. The exact body count remains disputed, but the massacre itself does not. There are alternative framings, of course. Some contemporary officials insisted the strike was really a revolution. Some later retellings pushed the story toward pure conspiracy, as if local workers had no intelligence or agency of their own. Others, enchanted by literature, speak as if the novel and the archive are interchangeable. We do not need any of those shortcuts. The workers of Magdalena did not need foreign puppet masters to know exploitation when they were living inside it. and we do not need magical exaggeration to understand the horror. The reality already carries enough weight to darken a century. At the same time, refusing fantasy does not mean polishing one side into sainthood. The atmosphere in the zone was tense. There were pressure tactics, hard lines, economic coercion, and moments of confrontation. Merchants, growers, labor leaders, radicals, local politicians, and officials all pulled from different angles. History deserves that complexity, but complexity is not confusion. Nothing in that complexity turns the square in Cienaga into a legitimate battlefield. Nothing in it makes machine gun fire on a labor crowd a reasonable instrument of public policy. The center remains what it has always been. The state chose bullets where justice was being demanded. That may be why the story still refuses to go quiet. Because it is not only about 1928, it is about a pattern that Latin America knows too well. Workers ask for recognition. Capital calls them unreasonable. The state calls them dangerous. The press splits. Foreign interests hover. The rifles arrive. Afterward, officials say the nation has been saved from chaos. Then history spends decades pulling the lie apart with bleeding fingers. Cienaga belongs to that larger family of wounds, but it also remains distinctly Colombian, rooted in its coast, its politics, its silences, and its stubborn memory. Return now to the rails. They begin this story, and they deserve to end it too. The train carried bananas, and with them the illusion that tropical abundance was just a matter of climate and enterprise. The train carried soldiers, showing that progress and force were sharing the same steel spine. And in testimony, rumor, memory, and literature, the train carried the dead away from counting. That is why the image survives so powerfully. It turns the entire enclave into a single moving symbol. Wealth goes in one direction, bodies go another. Official truth stands on the platform pretending not to notice. So, when someone reduces the Banana Massacre to a labor disturbance that got out of hand, stop there and notice the trick. A disturbance is a storm. This was a structure. A structure of profit, legal evasion, political alliance, military fear, and social contempt. The strike revealed that structure. The massacre defended it. Everything afterward, the decrees, the editorials, the diplomatic whispers, the literary immortality, all came later. First, there was the structure. Then there was the square. Then there was the firing. If we lose that sequence, we let power hide again in the fog it manufactured. And that brings us back to the question at the beginning, how many died? The most honest answer is also the hardest one to live with. We do not know exactly. We know the first official numbers were too small to trust as the full truth. We know that later testimony and political memory insisted the dead were far more numerous. We know a famous diplomatic report repeated the claim that the number may have exceeded 1,000. We know literature made the scale unforgettable. And we know that behind every disputed figure stands the same undeniable fact. Workers and civilians were massacred in Cienaga. Sometimes history withholds the census, leaving you with the wound. Sometimes the archive does not give you everybody, every name, every grave, every minute. But the absence itself speaks. It tells you how violence was followed by concealment, how fear scattered witnesses, how power tried to monopolize counting. Cienaga teaches that memory does not need perfect arithmetic to recognize injustice. A bloodied square, a town emptied by terror, a train wrapped in rumor, a government suddenly obsessed with revolutionary language, these are also documents. The land keeps receipts even when the paperwork has been taught to lie. So here is the final truth from our side of the fire. The Banana Massacre was not an unfortunate misunderstanding between a generous company and unruly labor. It was the violent repression of a strike rooted in basic human demands. It exposed how an export economy could make a region prosperous on the surface while keeping its workers precarious underneath. It showed how quickly a state can rename social conflict as subversion when foreign capital and elite comfort feel threatened. And it left Colombia with a question that still stings. What is a worker's life worth when profit is treated as national destiny? If the answer given in Cienaga was bullets, then the duty of memory is not to soften that answer. It is to keep naming it until the official perfume wears off. The workers asked for cash wages, safe housing, hospital care, accident protection, rest, and honest recognition. The response they met says more about the system than any company brochure or patriotic speech ever could. A society reveals itself most clearly in the way it treats those whose labor keeps it standing. On that December night, Colombia's banana frontier revealed a face it still struggles to fully confront. And the most unsettling thought is this: the powerful did not only try to win the confrontation, they tried to win the meaning. They wanted to decide what the dead were called, how the survivors were described, whether the crowd was remembered as workers or revolutionaries, whether the nation would picture a square or a battlefield, whether the train would remain a train or become an accusation. That struggle over meaning still has not ended. Every retelling takes sides, whether it admits it or not. Silence, especially, has always taken a side in stories like this. So when the station appears in your mind after this, do not imagine it empty. Imagine the flags, imagine the brief ultimatum, imagine the band trying to keep courage alive. Imagine the silence before the order. Imagine the first burst of gunfire. Imagine the doors closed the next day, and the frightened town measuring its grief in whispers. Imagine the rails stretching into the plain like a question the country still has not finished answering. Some places never stop testifying. They just learn to speak through absence, through repetition, through the things people are still afraid to count. Tell me in the comments which image stays with you most: the workers standing beneath the national flag, the bugles before the shooting, the empty streets the next day, or the train that keeps returning through testimony and memory long after the square has gone quiet. Muchas gracias. Thanks for trekking the hidden trails of Latin America with me. If tonight's story unsettled you, subscribe and ring the bell, because Latin America's most intriguing stories are far from over.